Greetings and welcome to what I'm sure will be a fascinating panel today with Adam Bledsoe and Priscilla Ferreira. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi and I teach in the Department of Global International Studies here at the University of California, Irvine. Today's event is part of a year-long Sawyer Seminar at UC Irvine supported by the Mellon Foundation. This year's seminar theme is Black Reconstruction as a Portal. And the idea of the seminar is to take up W.E.B. Du Bois's crucial study, Black Reconstruction in America, as a conduit to our present global crisis. This month, we're exploring the topic of Black Reconstruction geographies in different parts of the world. So next Wednesday, February 15th, we'll have Stefan Auma and Wangui Kimari discussing Black Reconstruction geographies in Africa. You can find more information about all our future events, as well as recordings of past events on our website, blackreconstructionasaportal.org, or on Twitter at Reading Du Bois. I need to thank my comrade and co-director of the seminar, Damien Sojourner from UCI's Department of Anthropology. We want to thank Melissa Valdez and Monica Rodriguez in the School of Social Sciences for all of their help organizing this event, as well as our postdoctoral fellow, Marilyn Grell-Brisk, and our PhD student fellows, Temi Tope Famodu in Global Studies, and Meryl Rowland in Culture and Theory. We also want to thank Amanda Swain and Ekua Arhin in the UCI Humanities Center. So you can see a lot of people have been behind the scenes helping to make today's event possible. Today's panel is entitled Black Reconstruction Geographies in Brazil. Our first speaker, Adam Bledsoe, is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Minnesota. He received his BA in geography from Dartmouth and his PhD in geography from UNC Chapel Hill. Much of his work underscores the necessary plurality of traditions of Black thought and Black geographies, which is to say there's no single tradition of Black studies. He works on the African diaspora with a particular focus on both Brazil and the United States. And you can find some of his writings on anti-Blackness in the journals Area and Society and Space, his writings on the continuities in anti-Black racism between progressive and right-wing administrations in Brazil, his work on racial capitalism and diverse economies in Geoforum, on Black self-defense and on Afro-Brazilian resistance to extractivism in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, his work on marronage, a really key theme in his writing in Acme and in the Southeastern Geographer, and his work on the field of Black geographies and the methodological approaches to what he calls geographies of Blackness in Antipode and Progress in Human Geography. He's working on a book related to his research today on Afro-Brazilian Quilombo communities in Bahia, and we're really excited to have him here. Our second speaker is Priscilla Ferreira, and she's an assistant professor of geography at Rutgers University. She received her BA in the Sociology of Ethnic Studies from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and her PhD in geography from UNC Chapel Hill. Much of her work sits at the intersection of diverse and solidarity economies, Black feminist and queer-led social movements, and urban geographies. You can find some of her most recent work on racial capitalism as a blind spot in the theory and practice of solidarity economies in Brazil in Geoforum, and her incredibly moving piece on Black feminist geographies that ache and bond in Women's Studies Quarterly. She's also published important interventions into Black and queer geographies in Portuguese, and she's just organized an incredible gathering on global Black geographies that Adam and I both had the privilege of attending in Rio de Janeiro, that focus on themes such as policing and abolition, women-led social movements, solidarity economies, memory, resistance throughout the urban landscape in Rio de Janeiro. And I think that gathering and her writing really demonstrate that radical forms of praxis arguably lie at the heart of her theoretical and practical empirical interventions. And this is such a welcome contribution in academia, and one that we've been trying to focus on as well in our seminar. So please join me in welcoming these two fantastic speakers, incredible human beings, and following their talks, we'll open up the conversation to a Q&A. We'll ask them to ask each other just a question to get us started, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Feel free to type your questions if you want as they're delivering their talks in the Q&A box. But for now, I will turn it over to Dr. Bledsoe.
Thank you, Yusuf. Appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with my comrades, right? People that I have been in conversation with for years now, more than a decade at this point. So I'm happy to be here, happy to have the opportunity to speak about some things that I've been thinking through recently and trying to kind of make sense of. And in a lot of ways, it is really fitting and really wonderful to kind of have Black Reconstruction be the focus, right, of this particular presentation, in part because Black Reconstruction was such a formative part of my graduate school education. It's even more fitting that Dr. Al-Balushi is the one to be putting this on and inviting me to speak, because we kind of had a running joke throughout graduate school after I read Black Reconstruction that all the conversations we would have about, the state of our country, the history of the United States and all this stuff, my ending point at all of these conversations would always be, I mean, haven't people read Black Reconstruction? Don't they understand the origins of all of this? So when Dr. Al-Balushi asked me to be a part of this, I kind of chuckled, but also jumped at the opportunity just because of how formative it has been. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really kind of my first attempt actually at explicitly bringing together the work I've done in Brazil and the work I continue to do in Brazil and the lessons, right, and thoughts that I have kind of come back to over the years in Black Reconstruction. So I'm going to start out kind of with a discussion of the framings in Black Reconstruction that have been provocative and important and useful for me before I get to a conversation about how I think these lessons apply to the work that I've been doing in Brazil. I first came to Black Reconstruction while doing my master's at the University of North Carolina, and Black Reconstruction figured very prominently into my thesis. And my thesis was sort of an attempt to offer a summary, but also kind of a synthesis of work being done in geographies of race, Black geographies, and how those things kind of squared with the Black radical tradition. This involved reading thinkers like Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson, and a variety of other scholars, to try to think about what contributions Black radical thought can offer, right, to geography, which I think is a conversation that has been happening in a greater intensity now, as opposed to when I first approached this work, right, in the 2010, 2011, 2012 time period. One of the things that was incredibly useful and very, provocative, very generative for me when it came to Black Reconstruction was Du Bois' explanation of the general strike. So I have a couple of quotes here from my thesis that I haven't actually gone back and read since I wrote it. So this was kind of fun to go back and see what I was thinking about 10 years ago. But in his rendering of the general strike, and I'll get into a little bit more of the details about that in a second, what I really saw and what really stuck with me was the clear sort of explanation of how enslaved Black people of the U.S. South were very carefully and closely analyzing the situation in which they found themselves. The idea of analysis and trying to chart out Black analyses was a big part of my master's, and it's something that I've continued to think about and think through. Yusuf mentioned the Pluralities of Black Geographies piece that I co-authored with Willie Wright. In a lot of ways, I think we could see that piece as sort of an outgrowth, right, of the thinking that I was doing at this time and in the conversations that we were having at UNC at that time. Du Bois puts forward an argument about emancipation to kind of give a little bit of background for people who maybe are not as familiar with Black Reconstruction, maybe haven't read it. Du Bois puts forward an argument in the chapter titled The General Strike, where he basically says that emancipation, the emancipation of enslaved Black people in the U.S. South was an outgrowth of, right, their analysis and agency as workers and as sort of, analytical political actors, I would say. This account of emancipation breaks significantly with what we are commonly taught, right? That it was the Northern armies, that it was the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That it was sort of the Northern desire, right, to free the slaves that freed enslaved people. And instead, what Du Bois puts forward is an argument that despite all of the obstacles that were placed in front of them, after careful analysis, and realizing that the Union armies could not send them back to the plantations and that Southern plantation owners were in no position to maintain them on the plantations, enslaved Black people, enslaved Black workers left the plantations in droves, right? Ultimately, ending the plantation economy as it had existed. And he says, eventually sort of turning the tide of the Civil War towards the Union and allowing the Union to prevail against the Confederacy. Now, I want to be clear here that Du Bois, is upfront that in his estimation, this wasn't necessarily the majority of the enslaved population that participated in this general strike, but that it was enough to unilaterally end slavery, right? That there was going to be no going back to slavery after this. And one of the things that really stuck with me as well, something that I thought a lot about, spoke with my advisors a lot about, was the quote that Du Bois employs from a Union soldier who says that there was no Moses to lead this movement, right? Meaning that there was no one singular figure that sort of rallied the enslaved populations of the South to leave the plantations. This was, for lack of a better term, kind of an organic mass movement that took place. So to think about emancipation, right, as being something that was undertaken by the enslaved themselves was something that was entirely new to me. It was something that was incredibly sort of formative and very groundbreaking for me at the time. And it was something that, again, as I said, I continue to think about. An important component of the argument and what makes this so groundbreaking is that Du Bois couples that argument with very clear evidence to show that the North was not at all interested in freeing enslaved people prior to the moment of emancipation, right? It was only after the enslaved people began to self-emancipate that the North realized that this could be beneficial to the war effort. And instead, what Du Bois does is he charts out, right, and explains the ways in which the North, right, as a political and social kind of entity, was itself very racist and anti-Black in its own right, right? So he kind of, he puts to rest or dispels kind of this myth that emancipation was the goal or the desire of Northern politicians and Northern people generally. Nonetheless, as the years have gone on, and the more I've come back to this piece, and I teach this piece almost every year in my Black Geographies class, so it's one that remains important. It's one that remains very central to my understandings of U.S. history and the possibilities of collective Black struggle. But I also think that when we really look at the text, right, and sit with it, it forces us to ask what insights we're able to glean, right, from this moment. Aside from the act of self-emancipation, which obviously is incredibly important and incredibly vital to understanding sort of everything that comes in the wake of the general strike and the Civil War. I think this is a brilliant argument that Du Bois has put forward, and it is an argument that's against the grain of our traditional kind of understandings of the moment. Nonetheless, when we look at the archival sources or the sources that Du Bois is drawing on, we see in a lot of ways that even in an acknowledgement of the fact that something like the general strike was going on, we're kind of forced to read these moments through a non-Black lens, and in this case, a white lens, right? So that quote that I had previously about there was no Moses to lead it is part of a larger quote that I've drawn out here. And in this quote, you see the Union soldier goes on to say that, unlettered reason, what does he say? The mere inarticulate decision of instinct brought them to us, right? They decided that their interests were identical with the objects of our armies, and they came to us, right? And so in this sense, what is kind of obscured, right? What's occluded is what the striking formerly enslaved Black populations of the South actually thought about this moment, right? And as we go through Black Reconstruction and read it, there are moments when we get excerpts from Frederick Douglass. There are moments when we get excerpts from, meetings that a variety of Black religious leaders and a variety of community leaders sort of talk about what their aspirations for Reconstruction, post-emancipation, what their hopes are for those moments in U.S. Society. But we don't necessarily get a sense of the on-the-ground, right, conversations, the organizational methods, right, the ways in which the Black people that are being talked about, right, actually would have understood and analyzed the situation. Right? And so this is something that I want to sit with, right, and think about, something that has pushed my own work, and been forced to kind of reckon with the fact that official records, in particular historical archives, leave little information about, right, Black analysis, or how the actions on the ground were actually taking place. So that's kind of what years of reading and thinking about Black Reconstruction have pushed me towards. Obviously, thinking about all of this, I've been in conversation with a variety of other thinkers, bodies of literature, and the like. But Black Reconstruction is one, I think, really great example of how we can have critical historical work that pushes the bounds of what we know and pushes us in new directions to think about moments that we would otherwise take for granted, right? That are part of kind of our national memory or national myths, but can also sort of show the shortcomings that we need to think about and perhaps try to address in getting a more nuanced understanding of our past, our historical past, but also what this might mean for the future. So now shifting to my work in Brazil, right? As Yusuf mentioned, I work in the Brazilian state of Bahia, which is in the northeastern part of the country. I've been doing research in Brazil since around 2011, so a little over a decade. But I've been working specifically with the three communities pictured here on the right for a little less than a decade. This summer will be the 10th sort of anniversary of when I encountered the communities of Ilha de Maré, Tororó, and Rio dos Macacos, which I'll talk about in just a second. All three of these communities are Afro-Brazilian communities. They trace their communal origins to pre-emancipation times, meaning that all of them have a narrative of having been formed before 1888, which is when slavery was officially ended, right, abolished in Brazil. They have autonomous ways of life, the fishing communities. They practice, small-scale agriculture and natural resource extraction. I'm not going to get into all the details of these communities. I'm happy to answer questions about them in the Q&A. But one of the ways that they self-identify is as Quilombo communities. Right? Some of you may be familiar with this term, but for people who are not, the term Quilombo is of African origin, right? Central African origin, but it has since been taken up through the colonial Brazilian period up to the present to signify what we might call maroon communities, right? Autonomous Black communities that have their roots, again, in pre-emancipation times. And it has kind of a connotation of both independence and, it has a connotation of being in the tradition of and inheriting legacies of resistance to anti-Black racism and systemic racism in Brazil. And I would argue that in order to kind of get a sense of the stakes of quilombismo, right, or marronage, or the creation of quilombo communities in Brazil, we have to understand how quilombo communities are understood historically. Right? Understanding how people understand quilombos helps us get a sense of, what is at stake and what people believe is possible from a quilombo existence. And the most famous example of a quilombo in Brazil, the one that's talked about most, the one that's held up as kind of the quintessential example of a Brazilian Maroon community, is that of Palmares. Right? Palmares exists in what is the present-day state of Alagoas, and was very close also to the present-day state of Pernambuco. It was a Maroon community that existed, the way the story goes, for the majority of the 17th century. So from around 1600 or 1605 to about 1695 are kind of the rough dates that are given for the existence of the Quilombo. Right? Pictured on the left here is their famous military leader, the final kind of great, chief military leader of Palmares, Zumbi. But ultimately, the story of Palmares is sort of told in a way that prioritizes or privileges its destruction as kind of the most important historical moment in the community's history. Right. There's much discussion of the size of Palmares, right? Palmares, they say, had potentially tens of thousands of people. It had a very complex and savvy kind of military apparatus that allowed it to defeat and hold off Portuguese military and Dutch military expeditions. But ultimately, the way the story goes is that Palmares was destroyed by a paramilitary organization, along with the help of local Portuguese forces, indigenous paramilitary forces, and enslaved military corps as well. And so we see in a lot of the historical literature about Palmares, right, that at the end of the day, the Quilombo was destroyed. The people were either re-enslaved, killed, or committed suicide. And this is the important part, with the end of Palmares, ended the threat that Quilombos played to the development of sort of a modern Brazilian nation. And yet, right, if we're going to, again, engage critical historical work that I would say is in a similar kind of vein to a work like Black Reconstruction, critical historical work, particularly by historians like the Brazilian historian Flávio dos Santos Gomes, we can see that the destruction or the military defeat of the larger sort of confederated entity of Palmares was more than likely not the end of marronage in the foundation of Quilombo communities in the northeastern part of Brazil. Gomes has some really, wonderful, I think, again, against the grain arguments that draws on archives to show that in the decades following the apparent military defeat at the end of the 17th century of Palmares, there were reports, right, of Maroon communities in Quilombos, in Alagoas. There were reports of some of the people of Palmares escaping and creating settlements in smaller Quilombo communities in Pernambuco and Paraíba, right, in the northeastern part of the country. And when we look at sort of concentrations of self-identified Quilombo communities today, we see the concentration, sort of the greatest concentration of them is in the northeast, right, which is where Palmares was. Some of you may be familiar with the recent publication of Gail Jones' novel, Palmares, for which she has clearly done a lot of historical work in and about Brazil. And she has an excerpt here where she talks about this very thing, right, in kind of a literary representation of this. Following the destruction of Palmares, one of the characters in the book talks about the fact that there's hundreds of Quilombos, right, across the country. It's not a country at this point, it's a colony, but across the Brazilian territory, there are Quilombos everywhere, right, including in the places where Quilombos like Palmares had been presumably destroyed. Right? And that's kind of one of the main driving sort of narrative moments of the story are the people leaving Palmares after it's been destroyed and trying to create what they call a new Palmares. Right. So this is something, I say all this to say that this is something that has animated both critical historical work as well as, more sort of literary work as well. So again, we see how dominant historical narratives, right, can serve to sort of discount the viability of Black political action. In the context of the general strike, right, we see how while there were these sort of alternative Black spatial analyses and practices taking place, we see the way that our reliance sort of on dominant archives runs the risk of us assuming that those actions, right, on the part of Black actors, the striking ex-slaves in the U.S. South, were really sort of an outgrowth or a response, more of a response to the actions that were taking place among, right, the quarreling white people, Northern armies and Southern armies. In the context of Brazil, right, and thinking about Palmares and the Quilombo phenomenon, we see that on the one hand, there's a historical tendency to deny, right, the viability or possibility of the persistence of quilombos, and on the other hand, we're sort of reliant on these archives that only allow sort of glimmers, right, to come through, sort of incomplete understandings of the continuities of quilombismo or marinage in these cases. To get a sense of what this looks like in the cases that I work in, right, I've found this is one of the earliest kind of representations of the communities, or I should say the spaces that I do my work in that I found, right? There is a early 18th century poem titled Ilha de Maré that is written by a Brazilian poet of the 17th and 18th centuries, Manuel Botelho de Oliveira, where he gives it's this whole long, really sweeping poem about all of the characteristics that he sees of Ilha de Maré, right? What's grown there, the fruits, the flowers, the vegetation, right? How beautiful this place is. He has this description of this grand sugar mill that took place there. And I've read some accounts that say this is proof in a way that there were, the sort of some of the originators of the communities that live there today could have very well been present there at this time, right? If there was a sugar mill on the island, then more than likely it would have been enslaved Afro-descendant populations that would have built it, that would have administered it, would have worked on it. And people use that oftentimes as an example of this is one of the earliest representations we have of a Black presence on Ilha de Maré. And yet in this poem, there's no explicit mention of them whatsoever, right? And so again, if we try to read obscured or unclear kind of references to a Black presence, to a Black sort of politics, we can use poems like this to see, right, or try to infer a Black presence on the island. But I would argue that, again, this centers a non-Black perspective to try to, evidence a Black presence in the place. And I think we would be better off, honestly, and there are examples of people doing this, right? We would be better off sort of privileging the historical knowledges and communal stories that Afro-descendant populations in Brazil, but also elsewhere, right, that they have of their communal origins. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, I have pictures from the film Quilombo Akumabu, which was a short documentary done about the community of Alto do Tororó, which is one of the communities that I mentioned I work with. And at the beginning of this documentary, a number of the community elders and community leaders talk about their understandings of kind of the historical origins of their community. And so José Salvador, who was one of the community elders interviewed, in the documentary, talks about, his family's sort of origins in the community, which, as it were, are also the community origin story, right? And so the story that he tells is of his grandfather and 3 of his friends stealing a boat in the sugarcane growing region of the Reconstruction, which is just adjacent to where these communities are today. And prior to the moment of emancipation, so prior to 1888, taking that canoe, traveling, along the coastline, and eventually ending up in Ilha de Maré, where they met, they say, the quilombolas that were living there before making their way to where the community resides today in Alto do Tororó. Okay, so again, we get a sense here of not only a potential origin story, or the origin story as the community understands it, but also sort of the origin point for the continued Quilombo ethic that persists today. I would say that this approach is one that is germane, right, to the Brazilian context. Again, some of the newer work being done by Flávio dos Santos Gomes talks about this specifically, and how he sees present-day rural communities, and in some cases urban and suburban communities, as continuations of the process of Quilombismo, of the creation of Quilombo communities, right? The Quilombos never disappeared. They disseminated, right? They spread out. And if we look at, the landscape, Brazilian landscape today, we can encounter these, we can see traces of these communities and get a sense of, right, that history of resistance, that history of autonomy and struggle based on the stories that they tell and the experiences that they have today. So, why is this, and I would argue that in a way, those knowledges, right, those histories, those communal stories comprise part of what we might call the unknown, right? Because they're not part of the traditional kind of archive. They're not always taken up as valid data or information that can be represented in a traditional historical document or in traditional historical research. And so they're unknown vis-a-vis the dominant way of understanding the world. And yet, they're clear, right, if we engage them seriously, as sort of indicators of not only the historical presence of a Black form of analysis in politics, but also as an origin point and an informer of what a Black politics might look like, one form of Black politics might look like today. So why rely on this? Why think about this? I would say that the arguments that are put forward in Black Reconstruction offer us an important lesson of how we can approach critical studies of Black struggle across the diaspora. If we rely on dominant archives and historical representations, and here we can think about the general strike, right, from Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, or we can think about work and historical work done on Brazilian quilombos, relying on dominant archives and historical representations can run the risk of reproducing the notion that Black populations are not in and of themselves viable political actors. In Black Reconstruction, we see how even an account of emancipation, which is profoundly contrary to dominant historical work, still relies on data sources, which can easily be co-opted into a narrative that Black political action was primarily an outgrowth of white agency, right? That the unlettered reason, the instincts of the enslaved ultimately had to recognize itself or had to mobilize itself based on the goals of the Union Army, right? In this formulation, Black political analysis doesn't really exist, right? At best, it becomes an appendage to a project that we see, given the quote on the left here, is ultimately an anti-Black one, right? The argument that Du Bois puts forward is that ultimately sort of the industrial aspirations of the North made use of the abolition democracy tendency, right, that was embodied in Black struggle at the time, to achieve its own ends while ultimately turning its back on the tenets of abolition democracy. In the context of Quilombo struggles, I would say that the assertion of Black autonomy has been, in the historical record, represented as a project that could not succeed on its own, right? And that this idea of the illegitimacy of Black struggle is central to the present-day Brazilian state's program, right, of delimiting and controlling Black communities under the auspices of sort of multicultural recognition of Black territorial rights. In reality, in this formulation, there is no room for Black territorial self-definition, right? Instead, the state has the sole right to define a Black or Quilombo existence. And while critical historical work holds out the possibility that autonomous Black communities might exist beyond surveillance and control, right? We see in the work of Gomez, as I said, that there's something going on there, right? There is some alternative Black Quilombola politics that is happening. I also would argue that to really engage with this as a possibility, we need to engage with the actual communities, right, that are born of this struggle. And I would say that an example of that, and what is kind of proof of that in the context of the work I've done in Brazil comes from an interview that Yusuf and I did this past summer, at the event, the Global Black Geography Symposium that he mentioned, right, that Priscilla took the lead on organizing. And when asked in this interview what it meant to be Quilombola, right, Dona Fatima, who is a community leader and elder from the Quilombo of Tororó, said that to be Quilombola, right, is resistance, but that is part of their roots, right? That to be Quilombola is in their history, in the history of the communities, right? It's something that they keep alive amongst themselves. And in order, I think, to engage that, right, not necessarily to understand it or to be able to represent it, but in order to engage that and get any kind of sense of it, a direct engagement with the populations that practice it is necessary. So I'm going to end there, turn it over to Priscilla, and I look forward to people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We'll now pass it to Priscilla Ferreira. Priscilla, I think we need you to turn on your video and unmute if you can hear us.
Okay, here I'm back. Good. Hello, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here, thinking and feeling, and also, sharing all the stories that are part of not just resistance but love work with this communities and the people with whom we've learned how to ask some of the questions that we shared today. So I wanted to start by just acknowledging their offerings of their personal lives, the offerings of their Black analytics, the offering of their vocabulary to help me name some of the shifting lenses that I engage with to see and also to name and explain some of the dynamics of anti-Blackness that go oftentimes under the radar of analytics in Black, in urban studies, and I just wanted to say ashe and gratitude to the women and the stories that I'm gonna talk to you about today. Let me share this slide here. I will keep my screen in slide mode because I organize myself better. And if you haven't seen me speak at any time, I'm a freestyler. But today I'm going to read a little bit, but I want to keep my slides open this way. So thank you, Yusuf and the Sawyer Seminar for inviting me to reflect on Black reconstructions in Brazil. And today I'm going to reflect on a little bit on, what can we learn about Black urban reconstructions that Black women currently organize in the midst of economic sabotage and anti-Black state violence. Also ask the question how to meet the material and emotional needs that emerge in the work of envisioning and organizing radical struggles. And then I'm gonna talk about some examples of Afro-Brazilian community practices of mutual aid and generative solidarity economy. So you see the title was a little bit of a wordplay. It says, time is honey, in a wordplay with time is money, because one of the things that is, most insightful to me in the analytics of Du Bois was, shifting from, a traditional narrative in the, in the naming and the wording of the slaves were, emancipated, and shifting it on a language of, Black workers forced a strike, a general strike that led to their self-emancipation. So the title was a little bit of an insight that came to me. How is it that we shift from thinking about time is money and the dehumanization of Black workers and their bodies and their territories and their theories towards thinking about the ways that Black sociality, Black knowledge, Black life, and Black time is experienced in autonomous ways. So I wanted to do you only see Yusuf, if you can help me, do you only see the slides?
Yes, we just see your slides right now.
That's awesome. Okay. So global Black politics and notions of Black freedom, Black sovereignty, Black self-determination have appeared in thought-provoking conversations about Black reconstructions in this seminar series that looked at the multiplicity of experiences and trajectories and social spatial formations. Each of the previous conversations in the series of dialogues have pointed out many methods of Black reconstructions across geographies. I appreciate the invitation to talk about Black reconstructions in my home country, Brazil, because it's really crucial that we be attentive to the communalities and nuances of Black community formations, and to look at how solidarity functions as tactics of survival and affirmation in each of these places where Black freedom is constantly sabotaged, but Black life still thrives through concrete and imaginative work at the intersections of geographies of domination and geographies of resistance, as McKittrick has framed it. Du Bois' work, historically, his immense historical work, reveals how the project of sovereign Blackness has been continuously interrupted and undermined, as Joan Lewis articulated in his talk in this last seminar last week. At the same time, it gives us precious and encouraging insights into how we can shift our lenses and language from the narratives of abolition to Black worker self-emancipation general strikes. Borrowing from Jessica Gordon-Amhart, who draws very closely on Du Bois' work to excavate the Black history of cooperativism, we learn how to go beyond the worn-out past narratives and fatally predictable narratives of Black dismay to see what Jessica calls collective courage, or the ways that Black communities have continued and continues to build and rebuild lives, sociality, places, economic possibilities that have been attacked and destroyed. In this presentation, I will share some of the ways that Black reconstructions take place in contemporary urban struggles in Brazil. And we'll see some of the ways that Black communities claim their rights to the favela their rights to mobility and to not be circumscribed and arrested within the confines of an anti-Black terrorist spatial project that actively organizes abandonment, as Ruthie U. Morris has termed it, through deadly policies that lead to displacement, dispossession, and extermination. With permission from these sisters, I will also share some of the experiences and work which, however small and made invisible, oftentimes play a role in Black reconstructions on the ground and on the daily. I will highlight their experiences and claims for reparation, freedom, and self-determination at different layers: spiritual, moral, physical, economic, communal, and spatial. Ronick and Oliveira have indicated that Brazilian studies, the Brazilian urban studies, studies race. It still appears most often that in Brazilian urban studies, race still appears most often as a mere descriptive in development indexes in general, or in reference to particular features of Afro-Brazilian organizations and places, not as a central axis of social spatial inequality. Predominant approaches address the analytics of spatial segregation in terms of the marginalization of spaces of poverty, paying insufficient attention to the mapping of racial inequality over spatial inequality, characteristic of Brazilian cities. Rio de Janeiro's urban landscape is rife with geographical markers symbolic of the transmutation of plantation logics, to use a term also suggested by McKittrick, into contemporary forms of racial capitalist spatial ordering. The symbolism of spatial coloniality reveals itself, for instance, all over downtown Rio de Janeiro. So this is Praça 15, as downtown Rio. This used to be the square where the Portuguese court was located in the 1900s. And then there's the tribunal, there's the church, and there's the palace of the Portuguese emperor. This is a display of Praça 15, the square of power. When we look at the picture, we see no slaves anywhere to be found. Everything is orderly, and it's a picturing of order and progress, which is what stands on the Brazilian flag today. Right on the side of it, though, what we see was the former slave market on the Rua Direita, just behind the square of imperial power. Then that is then populated with Black workers. When we look at Praça 15, then we see this building over here, which now stands where in Praça 15, it used to be the slave market. The former slave market is today the current building of the stock market. So literally a stock market building in contemporary spatial ordering of Brazil has been built on top of a former slave market. When you look at this picture, you see the water fountain over here. It's precisely this water fountain here on this picture. This water fountain, and that's downtown Rio. This is the part behind the water fountain, is the part where the greatest number of the enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil, and the greatest numbers in the world, really. So another example of racialized geographies are in contemporary Brazil are also the acrylic panel barriers installed along 7 kilometers along 2 of the main highways that traverse the city, Linha Vermelha, Linha Amarela, which serve to both hide out of sight, but also to cite racial segregation as a physical and symbolic barrier that stands between places of residence of Black workers that built those highways and the flow of capital that circulates through them. In my work, I've argued that every slum is somewhat a quilombo, is an urban black trouble spot. And Singer has argued that choices of property, rules, let's just made a comment, by the way, that this acrylic panel barrier was built right before the World Cup. And that was a way, this is a main highway that goes from the airport all the way through downtown. So that was a way to hide. This one is Favela da Maré. Singer has argued that choices of property rules entail choices about quality and character of human relations and myriad choices about the kind of society we will collectively create. As the end of the institution of slavery in Brazil appeared inevitable with the prohibition of transatlantic slave trade in 1850 due to the pressure of the British Empire, the local white aristocracy immediately made changes to the law regulating land property, such as the land law of 1850, that further instituted barriers for former slaves and free Black workers to access land both in rural as well as in urban areas. Concomitantly to this legislation that enclosed land rights, the policing apparatus increased significantly at the immediate post-abolition period. Meanwhile, changes were also made to penal laws, such as the institution of poor law, the 1890, and the vagabond law in 1890, which prohibited begging, alcohol use, loitering, and the practice of capoeira, an Afro-Brazilian martial arts. These activities became subject to imprisonment of 2 to 6 months. Rural exodus in the post-abolition, barriers to accessing land, a new immigration policy that gave incentives, such as tenure of plots of land and loans to European immigrants, as well as the preference for white immigrants in industrial jobs, represented key factors for the unequal integration of Afro-descendants in the process of industrialization and urbanization of an emerging capitalist society. In the beginning of the 20th century, favelas would often be described as places of capoeiras, practitioners of capoeira, vagabonds, drunkards, and thieves. They were considered filthy places, hubs of immorality and disease that posed a public health and security problem for the city and stood as moral hindrance to modernization. Such arguments have justified invasive sanitation interventions and brutal policing in favelas, as well as in anti-Black policies aimed at cleaning out slums from the city landscape. This racialized spatial imaginary has underwritten urban policies for favelas throughout the 20th century. Urban policies for favelas have shifted from removal without alternative places of residency offered to the families until the 1950s, to later forceful evictions to precarious public housing projects further away from the wealthy area in the 60s and the 70s. Then since the 80s, there has been a combination of forceful evictions and urbanization of favela, as Valadares and Abreu has extensively written about. Despite these shifts, anti-Black stigmatization and criminalization of favelas in Rio has remained a reiterative aspect of geographical coloniality that shapes urban segregation along race lines. So when we're talking about spatial terrorism, this was the military intervention that was ordered by the former president, or actually he did a coup against Dilma Rousseff and ordered the militarization of favelas in Rio. This is 2018. And you know, when we think of the act of war as a declaration of war against a state enemy, what we see here is the Brazilian state declaring war against favela, majority Black spaces, and considering Black Brazilians as enemies of the state. Spatial terrorism and the blaming slum dwellers for the precarity of their living existence are mobilized by anti-Black necropolitics. Necropolitics here is understood as Mbembe defines it in the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of a maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead, end quote. Geographer Andrelino Campos writes about the relationship between the historical and ongoing processes of land privatization and land concentration in contemporary urban violence in Rio. His work suggests that urban conflict in the city that is typically explained as a class conflict is interwoven with racial antagonism. If in popular imaginary and speech, morros, meaning the hilltops, favela, is the geographical referent for the dispossessed and the exploited, and the asphalt is the geographical referent for the wealthy and the dominant elites, morro is also a racial metaphor for Blacks, and the asphalt is a racial metaphor for whites. Spatial metaphor, right? So the spatial dichotomy between morro and asphalt describes racialized socioeconomic distance, which is concretely spatialized in geographical proximity. I contend that maintaining the precarious juridical relationship of favela dweller to the land they de facto occupy, particularly in cases where there are occupations of public land that could be more easily resolved for the benefit of the occupants, serves as a strategy that has allowed for and justified displacement, the clearing of Black bodies from the land. If the property, the slave, meaning the property, the slave cannot own property, the land. Urban, let me fast forward just a little bit here because the sake of time. The criminalization and violent intervention in favelas and police incursions into favelas, which I argue also function as urban quilombos, has led me to start thinking about how might we consider favela and what kinds of arguments might we articulate to consider urban favelas as urban quilombos, right? What is the spatial history? And Andrelino Campos has done incredible work to map how the self-emancipated slaves in the outskirts of the city of Rio moved on to the city, especially in the downtown area, to start forming the first iterations of what is now called favela. The formations of favela, I contend, has also drawn and continues to draw on Black radical praxis of quilombagem. Here, I define quilombagem drawing on from a relational approach drawing on Black Brazilian thinkers as Abdias do Nascimento, Clóvis Moura, Flávio Gomes, and Beatriz Nascimento. Quilombagem speaks of the ontological conditions of Black communities embedded in the interplay between geographies of dominance and geographies of creative resistance. However, the vintage point here is one that highlights the concrete and imaginative Black spatial praxis and its role in the social production of space by focusing on the geographical knowledge, subjectivity, and Black agency, with the center the dominant geographical discourse that addresses favela as mere byproducts of inadequate economic development and efficient urban planning. Clóvis Moura, one of the important thinkers of Black slavery in Brazil, defines quilombagem as a radical praxis of self-emancipation as a social and historical movement that began in Brazil in the beginning of the 16th century and was similarly similar to Maronage movements in the Caribbean and other areas. It is characterized by the continuous formation of Black rebels and fugitives who build autonomous communities, quilombos. Quilombagem, or Maronage, persisted throughout slavery, and it permanently disrupted the slave system. Quilombos, small and large, short-lived and long-lived, spread around national territory, troubling authorities, forcing slave owners and the state to bear the permanent onus of the cost with consistent attempting at destroying quilombos. Many quilombos were destroyed and later reconstructed at different sites. Urban insurrections were also part of quilombagem movement. And so I turn now to talk a little bit about how in my work and field work, and now long-lasting relationship with Black women in favela City of God in Rio. This cartoon was made by the artist called Latuf, based on this picture here, and talk about how I view and consider the work that Black women organize in Brazil as examples of contemporary urban marronage. So while we're talking about destructive powers of the state, on the other hand, there's Black women organizing Black study, Black planning, Black fugitivity. This is a community center in Favela City of God. This is a reading moment. One of the volunteers reading for the kids. A lot of the reading that they do is very self-affirmative. Talk about their daily lives. This community child center was founded in 1996 by Sister Lucia Serafim, who was forcefully displaced from the South Side with her family. And her family was one of the first to arrive in what became known as Favela City of God. That Favela City of God was an urban project that was unfinished. And so the military regime, benefiting or taking advantage of a flood, forcefully removed favela Morro da Formiga to what was still an under constructed, unfinished housing project in the west side of Rio, what became known then as Favela City of God. So Lucia's she's lost 2 brothers, 2 nephews, and a brother-in-law in the drug dealing factions. Her brother became a drug dealer in command. If you have seen the film City of God, her brother, after one of the main characters was killed, he was one of the children who appears in the film. And because of the loss of her family, she wanted to create ways to prevent other children from having a fatal ending like that. And so she gathered her personal resources, and in her home alongside other women, created the first community childcare in a favela that today has 70,000 people and no public high schools at all to this day. It's 60 years old, this urban project. And so like when we're talking about life affirming marronage, Black women in the city, they reclaimed this space. This is the kitchen of an abandoned child care center that the mayor had started construction, never finished. So they reclaimed the space and they reclaimed the right to belong in that favela. And everything from feeding children's thought to feeding their bodies, to feeding them with love, is what they do on a daily without any support from the government, any grants or any kind of thing other than they just solidarity economies to regenerate their own life and experience around Black life and Black survival. The second story here that I wanted to share is also the story about Mãe Luizinha de Nanã. Mãe Luizinha de Nanã was also forcefully removed in the context of the World Cup from this neighborhood called this favela called Vila Autódromo, where they're trying to build constructions for the running cart competition. So they forcefully removed many families and they removed her terreiro. So if you don't know, candomblé is Afro-Brazilian religions that protect the cosmogonies of Afro-Brazilians, but they have also historically served as shelter, spaces of healing and medicine, spaces of counseling, and spaces of fugitivity for people who were, under threat for some kind of way. And so her terreiro was destroyed, and she was forcefully removed to another neighborhood. And she talks a lot about how one cannot build a condom Black community out of the blue, because it requires community and it requires territoriality, right? And so she has started to rebuild this place kilometers away from the one that was destroyed. And she started a garden, the sacred garden. Started her sacred garden. Started her sacred garden of the herbs. In Brazilian cosmologies, the herbs are dedicated to orishas, but it's also an ecological intervention in Black ecologies to protect the environment. So she started in this new place building a garden that was for the orishas, but also to protect the river, right in front of her new place. And she was then again attacked by neo-Pentecostalists who are also, a trend that's happening, religious racism in Brazil, and that was destroyed. I interviewed her for a documentary we're doing about Black women thinking about scarcity and thinking about abundance. And she told the story sadly, but also saying, after they destroyed it, I started to just rebuilding it inside my house. And the struggle goes on because the orishas are about ecological sustainability, and that's I do in service of my ancestrality. One last story that I want to share to conclude is the story about Rafaela Albergaria. Rafaela Albergaria, the sister with the pink cover, she ran for city council, for city representative this past election with the Workers' Party. And she didn't win the elections, but she is a community organizer. And she learned from, before she ran for elections, right? Before she was just an organizer, and she learned from her niece that her other niece had been dragged by the train in Rio and had been killed, and they didn't notify the family. And the sister saw that her sister had been killed by, dragged by the train. And she started a huge mobilization around the right to safe mobility. And she's taking on a lot of risks, including attacks from threats from the militia, who is starting to control, public transportation in many Black territories in the outskirts of Rio. And so this is, again, another example of the different, like whether it's health and ecological sustainability, public health and ecological sustainability with Nana, or education and nutrition with City of God, or mobility with Rafaela's work. These are life-affirming ways of saying we belong in the city, we built this city, but not only that, is really planned and it's interconnected. So I met these women together during last summer gathering, and was just absolutely moved by how they affirm their agency and their role in Reconstruction. So yes, with that, I just wanted to end, and we can continue. I can tell more details about their stories. And yes, I'll hand it over back to Yusuf. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ferreira, for a wonderful presentation. I think you've left us with a lot to think about, as has Dr. Bledsoe, with regards to autonomous kind of forms of Black geographies, the production of space, marinage, both in the countryside in relation to historical quilombos and in the city. So we will invite Dr. Bledsoe to join us again here now for a Q&A. And we have asked both of our speakers to get us started with the Q&A by asking each other a question. Before they do that, I just want to encourage everyone to please type your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you take your mouse to the bottom, you'll see a button that says Q&A. You can click that and type your question there. We will field them for Dr. Ferreira and Dr. Bledsoe. So who would like to get us started? Which of you would like to go first in asking the other a question?
Pri, I'm not sure, since you just talked, if you want me to ask you a question and you have to talk a bunch more, or if you're just like,
I'll ask you a question.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It laid a lot of the ground for just, articulating what are quilombos, what are the histories, what are the relevance, in Brazil and in the history of diaspora. So I felt I could jump into talking about quilombagem because you had laid that out too. But I wonder if I heard in our last I hear in your presentation you're talking about marronage in Brazil, and I am sure that people also often invite you to talk about a history of quilombos in the United States. Is there quilombos in the United States? I don't think there are quilombos in the United States. So, I could hear Brazilians saying that kind of thing to you. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And I think I'm here trying to talk about and articulate quilombagem as unbounded from, as unbounded from place, as a political undertake. So I wonder how you articulate that, both in terms of the territoriality of marronage in the United States and the political, dimension of what quilombism or marronage might mean for Black folks in the U.S.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. That is something that is a question that I get frequently, especially when I teach class, when I teach my undergraduate classes, especially get questions about that. How does this apply to the United States, or does this apply to the United States? And I would say that it definitely does. I mean, I think in some of the other stuff that I've written, I've said, marronage emerges everywhere that, particularly I would argue in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, everywhere that chattel slavery occurred, right, which is everywhere in the Americas. So the United States does have an actually very interesting history of marronage, both historically and I would say currently as well. So one of the historical examples I use, right, of the certain factions of the Seminole Nation in the Southern United States, and their history of both being Black and Indigenous space, right, and how there were Maroon components to that nation, and that there was wars actually fought over that question of two wars fought over that question of marronage in the U.S. Sylviane Diouf has that really wonderful book, Slavery's Exiles, where she goes through a discussion of the different Maroon communities that existed historically in the U.S. and talks about the Great Dismal Swamp, talks about Belle Isle and Bear Creek, I believe, which was in Georgia, Louisiana. There's records of them kind of across the Mississippi Delta as well. So from a historical perspective, I think, all of those examples are really interesting. But I also think there are ways that I think the thing about marronage is that the way that we kind of conceive of Black struggle also affects how we think about our relationship to marronage, right? And I think, and this was kind of getting at some of what I talked about in the reference to the Du Bois work, so much of our understanding of Black struggle in the US is an institutionalized one, right? That we fought for rights, that we tried to get emancipation from white people, that we've tried to sort of fit ourselves into these categories so that the measurement, right, the measuring stick for Black struggle is sort of one of inclusion, right? Whereas I think in other cases, when we're talking about marronage, I would say is the spatial, right, refusal of the object status, right, or the objecthood of Black people, right, and how that comes into being that it comes into being spatially. Now, to your question about kind of the movement of marronage and what does it look like to move, I think that one aspect of the history of marronage, right, in particular, the histories of places like Suriname or Jamaica, to a lesser extent, maybe Colombia and Mexico, we see an attention to one specific place, right? That one specific area is a site of marronage, and that marronage is sort of contained therein. Whereas I would say that if we look at a broader kind of hemispheric history and experience of marronage, maroons were highly mobile because they had to be, right? They had to be ready to move. They had to be ready to get up and go. And I would say that we can also sort of apply that to the historical understanding of marronage as well. Maroon experiences, I would say, persist into the present. Celeste Winston is somebody, colleague of ours at Temple, who's done and been doing really interesting work about what marronage can look like in Maryland, right? But I think this is kind of also what I was trying to get at in the talk today. In order to understand how marronage applies to the present, we have to be with those communities, right? We have to actually have some kind of knowledge of it, because in the U.S. in particular, examples of that in the archive aren't going to show up in the same way that other forms of Black struggle are. So I think it's sort of necessary to ally yourself, attach yourself, in hopefully a non-predatory, non-extractive way to these communities in order to have a sense of what that looks like in the present, both in the United States, but elsewhere as well. I don't know if does that get to what you're...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
My turn to ask a question now? Okay, yeah. So, yeah, Priya, I as always, love your work. I think it's so it's inspirational, it's thorough, it's insightful. It's just, you're my favorite. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about we talked about quilombaging, right? And I think you did a really, really interesting way of drawing out the different sort of phenomena that quilombismo or quilombaging marronage sort of addresses, right? You talked about the ecological question, you talked about transport, you talked about childcare and all these things, right? I'm wondering, have you ever come across situations in which maybe the autonomy that is necessary for a maroon struggle, is that ever sort of balked at or worked against within the Black community? And the reason I asked this question is because you mentioned the Pentecostalists, right, that destroyed the ecological space of Maya Louisiana, right? Or I think back to the piece that you wrote in Geoforum where you talk about the solidarity economies, right? And the push from some people in the solidarity economy to not foreground race, right, as an organizing kind of principle, which in my mind would talk about how, what did you say? You said at the beginning of your talk that race is too often treated as a descriptor, right, instead of like something to organize around. So, do you encounter that at all in your work, kind of cleavages within favela communities over an autonomous approach, say, versus I don't know, non-autonomous, more institutionalized approach?
Yes. Well, that's a great, and yeah, it's a great it's a great and a difficult question to answer in the sense that, okay, let me ground on this specific example of this displacement, right? The displacement that took place with Nana. In the narratives from like the interviews, and it was common to say it was very often there popped up sort of games of accusation, saying like, we are here, trying to resist, and we're gonna like put our lives in line for it. The government has offered me $1 million to remove me out of here, and I'm still gonna stay. And some accusations that people were not working in collective ways enough, which was felt that way, and therefore it was true in that way. The sabotage or feeling of sabotage within the community when people started getting removed, right? Because now that's what happened. Now the issue here is like, how is it that the psychological, say the psychological wage, right, that the Bois talk about, how does that function within a society that's not the black and white split? Right, they're like the racial, the myth of racial democracy is still very strong. Even within the families, what we can call black families, there are people who identify and could have been identified as white. So the experiences in a majority black space and the dynamics of how white supremacy entangles within even the family and the community dynamics makes the claim that Black fellows were sabotaging their own families or sabotaging the community a little bit hard to answer. Mm-hmm. But what I do want to say is that the city had, in this case, terrorist spatial tactics. So they would negotiate with one individual in the family. There's a picture, a historical picture, you can Google it, where like the husband didn't want to sell the house, but the wife wanted to sell the house. They were almost like split. And so the city came and destroyed the house in half. So the picture showed this man like, kneeling down in front of his house, and the half of the house that's left. They would come and they mark, this house is going to be destroyed by tomorrow. And then they're like, okay, if my neighbor is leaving, they're afraid, I'm also better sell, I'm also move out of here. And they would leave the debris on the street to make life unlivable, to make the space unlivable. So that was breaking down the resistance, but it could have been read as just sabotage of neighbors. Like my neighbors have sabotaged our autonomous process of claiming our right to stay in this favela. You see what I'm saying? So that's why it's a great question. It's a little bit, in this context of in this racial formation in Brazil, it's a little bit hard to know when is it that's actual black sabotage that's happening, and the dynamics of how the state, percolates the struggle and try to dismantle in all kinds of terrorist ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for both those initial questions. Those were really fantastic and useful to think through, I think. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in already, so thanks to the audience. Please keep them coming. And I should mention we have folks from all over the world on the line listening in, people from Michigan, people from Brazil, people from Kenya, people from South Africa. So please do participate and ask our speakers some questions here. Let's start with two questions that are asking, kind of building on this last question that you all were discussing, especially the one that I think Priscilla asked Adam. Maybe more contemporarily, Kirk Davis asks, what should the US learn from Brazil's experience? And Frank Wilderson says, hi, Adam, your friend Frank Wilderson here. My question is for both of you. What can Black activists learn from Black struggles in Brazil? So we often think of this the other way around, the kind of globalization of a US abolitionist discourse. What can, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction inform us, tell us about Brazil? But I think both these people are asking us about what can kind of contemporary US activists learn from the organizers and activists that you all have been working with in Bahia and in Rio especially.
Yeah. So those are great questions. And, I think it's really important, I think, and this was something we talked about in the symposium, this past summer, about learning from one another and seeing Blackness as kind of this global thing, that we can have conversations with, even if we do have sort of unique, say, national or territorial contexts. I would say that one of the things that really has stood out to me in Brazil, and one of the things that I've written a little bit about in that piece that Southeastern Geography that Yusuf mentioned, is the foregrounding, of an autonomous approach. And what I was trying to say in that piece is that, again, what I said a little bit in response to Priscilla's question is that in the US, we don't always think about, right, the autonomous approach as one that that we can do. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't, organize and struggle on a variety of scales in a variety of spaces, or against or through a variety of different institutions or actors. But I think so often in the conversations I have, just generally with people in the US, it always comes back to policy, right? Or trying to get trying to get laws on the book, trying to get jobs, trying to do all of those things, right? Work within the system to change it, which in a lot of ways makes sense. But I think one of the things that's really stuck with me about the histories and the legacies of struggle that I've seen with these communities that I've worked with in Brazil is that they don't want necessarily access to those things. They might work through them occasionally to kind of stall, right, the creation of a new pier in a port, or the expansion of a military complex that's going to displace their people or something like that. But their way of being, right, the way that they struggle is primarily organized around like respecting and propagating, right, one another as beings, right? And I think this is particularly useful when we look at the quote unquote progressive legislation that's come up in the Brazilian context, right? Brazil is one of the few places in the Americas that has legislation on the books that is supposed to recognize, territorially title and recognize Black territories. And again, something that I've learned is that learned from these communities is the pitfalls that come with that, right? The pitfalls of recognition, and how these territories are never recognized on the community's terms, right? The communities have their way of life that, again, we can see also evidence in Priscilla's work, what she's talked about today, that is thoughtful. It's, it's analytical. It is organic to, the specific places that the communities come out of. That doesn't matter to the state, right? And there seems to me in these communities to be a fundamental understanding with regard to that, in that I've seen these communities, refuse territorial titles that were, deemed generous in the media, deemed generous by the Brazilian state, right? They refused them. They've ignored them in some cases, and continue to operate sort of outside the strictures that have been placed on them in the event that a title is granted. And so, I would say, to kind of wrap this up, that autonomous approach, right, the self-definition, I think, is something that we can learn from in the Brazilian context. And it's not that there aren't communities that have done that in the United States, but I think the partial kind of reading that we have of, the Civil War, of Reconstruction, of the Civil Rights Movement, right, and the aftermath of all of those things have kind of led us to believe that there's something worth taking, right, from our power structures here. Whereas what the examples that I've seen in Brazil have been more about sort of creating one's own power structures. So,
Well, I think one thing that's very key in the ways that Black life is, organized and resilient and has the potential to heal and to recover, I guess, is the idea that time is honey. Like, I didn't talk too much about that, but that's what it is. Like, honey as in this regenerative potential, right? Of healing the wound, of like, it's anti-inflammatory, like the anti-anger, that burns inside of one's heart when, when our sister gets shot, just leaving a speech, you know what I mean? Like I'm talking about Marielle Franco, City Councilwoman, who got shot from the Favela Maré, who was elected and got shot leaving, Black women's gathering. And I mean, there's something about time, how we relate to time, how we experience time, that's so, it's so beautiful and it's powerful, because all healing requires a different protocol of time. all rebuilding requires a different understanding and a different protocol of time. Things take time. People have different time to offer. Like our understanding comes through out of clock time. It comes from the ashe. It comes from the vital, from the vital source of life that rules time, that rules flesh, that rules, so I think that's key. I think, in terms of like, talking about, Blackness, Frank Willison's work, every time I talk about Afro-pessimism with like favela organizers, they're like, yo, that's what I'm talking about. They're like, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Because it's like, general dishonor, gratuitous violence, natal alienation, that's it. Our pain, the grammar of our pain is not legible. And therefore, there's only so much that we can say about it to be heard. That's it. But that's illegible to them. It's very much so eligible to us. That's why we do study groups. Favela for whom, for by whom, what for, you know what I'm saying? That's why we sit, because we can read this in and out of books, in our own sense of timeliness that we need to breathe and recover. And so resistance is a fact, as much as we're doing it in the midst of gratuitous violence. There is a project of end of the world, and there's the world that has not been destroyed, and it shall not be. It just won't. There's no way it can be, because there's the material reality, and there's Ashe. Way and beyond the flesh, way and beyond the social spatial structure that we're in. So, I think that's something that I would say there's so much beautiful potential to learn from.
Can I add one more thing, Yusuf? I wanted to say one of the ways that I actually see, I feel like maybe I'm seeing this in the US context, is the call for something like abolishing the police, right? Not reforming the police, not getting, more Black people on the police force or body cams or anything like that, but identifying, right, an antagonistic institution and saying, we don't want this anymore. We don't want any of it. We don't want to reform it. We don't want to resolve it or occupy it. We want it gone, right? Which I think demonstrates the glimmers of, a potential sort of otherwise, the dismantling of institutions versus their occupation or reform.
Great, thank you both for that. We have one question here that I think you've already answered kind of in your own conversations over the last few comments, which is great, kind of about the Sea Islands and Palmares and favelas in Rio, and how do we kind of link these all from a Quilombajem perspective, which was, I think you've done a really wonderful job of answering. So I'm going to ask you each a question that's directed at you individually. One for Dr. Ferreira from Mario, who says, you mentioned this question in the beginning of your talk that has stuck with me: how to meet the material and emotional needs that emerge in organizing Black struggles. Can you say more on how you look and listen for this in your methodology? And then for Dr. Bledsoe from Temitope Famadou, she asks, how do land relations differ between Afro-descended Brazilians and indigenous communities when it comes to claims to sovereign land? Are certain claims viewed as more or less legitimate? How does the state mediate these claims?
It's such a beautiful question. Thank you for that question. I think about that all the time. In this piece that Yusuf mentioned, Black feminist geographies, the Aiken bond, I talk a little bit about that. How to incorporate a process of immaterial knowledge, immaterial source of data, right, in our work and translation and sharing. In this piece, I talk about how, I'm always troubled with like the deadly, fatal, like ideas of deadline. It's just so deadly. And I talk about lifelines, again, like a reference, a different protocol of time, how the work unfolds in such a way that we can attend to relationship building. Like these folks that I've talked about are people too, like with whom the relationship develops over time. And so the translation of that relationship into publication is of a different sort. So, you know, it's not perish or publish for me, but it's flourish in the struggle and in the love of thinking with and learning and honoring time and emotion that's embedded in that knowledge. And only after collective knowledge is ripe, it will flourish. So it's not publish or perish, it's flourish and publish. And it's a different type of timeliness. And confronting that with, you know, the idea of like tenure track, I always talk about tender check. I want tender check. I don't want tenure check. So, you know, the metrics is very different. So it depends on what one wants to do with their scholarship and the relationship and the radical like organizing that they're open to doing, is how open and like how prepared one is for the punishment, because the intellectual industrial complex will try and punish us. We need focus, right? There's like, is a lot of breathing meditation and talking with the people and just having comrades like Dr. Abalushi, my dear Yusuf, and my dear friend and comrade, and, you know, his scholar Adam Bledsoe. So this is how we roll. This is how we've been rolling. Allowing time and supporting each other through that. That's, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, to the question about land sort of relations between indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. In Brazil, I'll put it like this. I think the best way to kind of encapsulate this is that in the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, right, that came out of the end of the military dictatorship, indigenous rights are enshrined in the Constitution. Right? Afro-Brazilian land rights, in particular land rights for Quilombo communities, were made a transitory article, right, of the Constitution. And part of the reason that came about, transitory meaning eventually it is supposed to expire, right? And part of the reason that was done was because Black activists on the Constituent Assembly, right, who were coming up, creating the Constitution, drafting the Constitution, were pushing for its codification in the Constitution, right? That there should be land rights in the Constitution for rural Black communities. And the rest of the Constituent Assembly was like, no, basically, we're not going to do that, right? So what they did was put this obscure kind of language as a transitory article for Quilombo communities. But they did that, and Jan French's work talks about this. They did that because they didn't think that there were any Black communities that were going to make those land claims, right? So the assumption was that there weren't any, or at least not, you know, any kind of critical mass of Black communities present that would make land claims, right? And what they ended up doing unwittingly and unintentionally was create the conditions for what has been really, you know, in a lot of ways, an explosion of Afro-descendant land claims. Now, staying true to their desire and investment in the assumption of Black aspatiality, the Brazilian government at the federal level has titled very, very few. I mean, I don't even think it's 10% of communities that self-identify as Quilombos have territorial title. Whereas indigenous populations, you know, are very much more sort of recognized and have their land rights codified. If you know anything about the Bolsonaro presidential campaign, the first one of the things that he campaigned on was saying that, you know, indigenous populations only make up, I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but he said something like, you know, indigenous populations make up 10% of of the national population, but they have 30% of the land, right? That's not the case for Afro-Brazilian communities, right? That relationship of spatiality or that assumption of territoriality doesn't exist in the same way. And so, you know, legislatively speaking, Afro-Brazilian communities have far less, right, like concretely titled territory than indigenous populations do. Now, you know, I got to give the disclaimer, I'm not suggesting that indigenous Brazilians don't deserve land rights, or that indigenous people broadly don't deserve land rights. I'm not saying that at all, but there seems to be at the scale of the Brazilian nation, an acknowledgement of indigenous territoriality, spatiality that is not afforded Afro-Brazilian populations. All of that to say, I'm sorry, Yusuf, one last little point here, that they do organize with each other, right? This is not, you know, in my experience with the communities in Bahia, I should say, from my experience there, they organize with each other, they plan events with each other, they attend each other's, you know, rallies. And when one group goes to Brasilia to petition something to the government, oftentimes they're joined by the other party. So it's not a, you know, a conflict, a face-to-face kind of conflict that they necessarily have. But, you know, it does figure differently in Brazilian ideas of space and territory.
Thank you both for that. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I'd like to ask you, I think, drawing off another question here that was posted, to maybe elaborate a little bit more on some of what you've already discussed here about the relationship in these struggles that you've been involved with in the northeast of Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro, between kind of forms of autonomy and relationships to institutionalization and the state. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit more, Adam, about, you mentioned, for example, you've witnessed moments where Quilombo communities have refused land titles and other forms of things that are considered generous from the state. Could you tell us just a little bit more about the kind of complicated relationship that you may have witnessed with the state in these three Quilombo communities that you've told us about? And Temi has asked, Priscilla, you discuss solidarity economies and the favela economy as systems that were born out of struggle and grounded in epistemologies of care implemented by Black women. How has the state attempted to institutionalize these practices, and what challenges have been encountered in this process? And of course, in the back of my mind, again, thinking from Black Reconstruction that you both kind of were in conversation with so nicely today, there's a similar tension in Du Bois's account of the Civil War and of Black Reconstruction. On the one hand, we have a celebration of the general strike and the self-activity of the Black workers. And on the other hand, we have a portrayal of abolition democracy potentially as the actions of Congressman Stevens, Sumner, right, fighting for a more radical vision of abolition that might include not just political and civil rights, but economic rights and land redistribution. So in our conversations here, especially Damien has been pushing us to consider the kind of hidden stories that you referenced, Adam, I think, in your rereading of the archive, what might have happened on those spaces of Black self-determination where land was taken, right, like the Sea Islands. What was going on there? What were the freedom dreams, the dreams of abolition that were being enacted in those spaces? But in Du Bois's account, certainly there's this tension of what Reconstruction looked like between institutionalized forms that go through or come from the state and more autonomous forms. So if you could just speak a little bit to how you see those tensions playing out in the struggles that you've been a part of, that would be, I think, a great point for us to leave on.
Yeah, so you know, one of the things that I'm kind of returning to now, and I don't think I stated this, but the final quote that I had from myself in the presentation was from my dissertation, and it was something that I was thinking very intently about in my last year of graduate school, but that I'm just kind of returning to now, is the way in which the definition of what a Quilombo is, I would say, in the process of really being co-opted by the Brazilian state. And I would say that this is, you know, this is part of kind of the ongoing process, right, of denying Black spatiality, right, which I just gave the description of how historically Quilombo legislation came about, right? That legislation comes about and it exists as it does because there was an assumption that these Black spaces didn't exist, right? And in the process, I think, of trying to kind of, I don't know, maybe correct for their error or get their bearings about them, I think that the Brazilian state has really made an effort to co-opt this term, right? And to be the sole kind of definers of what it means to be a quilombo, right? So there's a whole process, right? A whole sort of bureaucratic process that a community has to go through to get titled, right? And, without going through each of the steps, at the end of the day, it's the state that defines, right, how much land a quilombo community needs, right? What history is valid, right? And what history actually serves to kind of demarcate their place. And then the public policy that will be sort of applicable to it, right? Will they get food aid? Will they have access to, right, historical traditional spaces, whether it's, river or coastal space, spaces of extraction, oftentimes, like Priscilla is saying, which have, spiritual significance for these people, right? But at the end of the day, what gets put on the books as being a quilombo space is defined by the state. And so the way that I've seen that play out and how that has, what has happened with these communities is that, in particular, in the context of Rio dos Macacos, the state was really insistent, right, that they take a significant diminution of their historical traditional territory, right? And so the first offer that the government gave them was like 5 hectares of land. They were going to actually move them out of their territory and put them in apartment buildings that they were going to create for them. And it was a years-long process that the communities sort of went through of denying these offers, turning down these offers that the Brazilian state was giving them. And every time they would do that, there'd be these kind of veiled threats from the state. Well, you could end up with nothing, and then, you don't know what's going to happen, because at that time, and they still are, the community was in conflict with the Brazilian Navy, right, which had visited all kinds of violence on them. And despite all of that, right, despite the government deciding that 57 hectares of land, 56 hectares of land was going to be enough for the community to reside on, and if they took this land offer, the Navy wouldn't be able to infringe on their territorial rights or any of that stuff. The community kept saying no. We know, right, what is ours. We know our territory. We're not taking anything less than this amount. And eventually they did accept a territorial agreement from the state. And I would say that, it's kind of a negotiation on all of their parts. In all these communities, I've seen this negotiation, because oftentimes it seems to be the most expedient way to prevent, right, further land grabs, further territorial degradation. But I think what the communities are also seeing is that the Brazilian state and these private, in some cases, private corporations, institutions are still doing these things even after they get their title, right? Even after they're awarded their territorial title. So, it's I think an ongoing process of struggle and ongoing negotiation that goes on. But I also think among the communities, from what I've heard, there's a very sort of clear understanding that even these apparent sort of moments of recognition really carry with them, renewed forms and new formations of violence. And yeah, I think sometimes it's one of the ways that they feel like temporarily they have to, engage with the state. But I don't think it ever becomes how they define themselves, right? They don't value themselves or validate themselves or their sense of being based on what the state might open its hand on. But I also think that this is something that we have to be paying attention to and thinking about, right? Taking direction from and allowing to inform our own analysis of Black struggle. Because like I said, Brazil is understood as having really progressive land rights when it comes to Afro-descendant communities. But the communities themselves know that this is a profoundly imperfect, if not, outright violent form of recognition. So I wish I had a more sort of triumphant note to end on, but that, that's the best way that I can think to explain it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess with Yusuf, can I quickly come back to my slide just to answer
Sure.
the question?
Yep.
Solidarity, economy, cooptation by the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to kind of run through the slides. I didn't have time to show this, but let me see. Well, please. well, anyways, see this okay, this picture here has Lucia, who founded the Child Care Center that I talked to you, about before. She was also the president of the first Solidarity Economy community bank in Rio. So, Black cooperativism as a praxis has been around for as long as we have existed. Now, how it gets named and how it gets defined is how, the contours of what our economic experience is considered legitimate or is not. In Brazil, solidarity economy got co-opted by public policies. So in 2002, responding to the movement of, like union organizers and like co-op organizers, Lula created the Ministry of Solidarity Economy in Brazil in 2003. And it became a public policy. There was a ministry and there's a state secretaries of Solidarity Economy, basically in all the states of the country. In Favela City of God, it was one of 4 other favelas where this solidarity banking was introduced. The same favelas where they started the pacifying police units program. So occupations of favelas by the police program. In their mind, it was one of the ways to bring development to the area, right? So here's the current mayor of Rio, Eduardo Paes. He was the mayor in 2013, when this picture was taken. And see the way there's like the contention is that they're trying to make it entrepreneurial for the youth project, right? While they're occupying with pacifying police unit, and the youth hold like heavily armed also in this territory, trying to protect that territory, right? Also contentions, right? Economic contentions. So they created this currency, and the community said, look, if we are going to have a currency, we're going to print on the currency the people that represent us in our history and how we have survived. So here's like this lady is also a mother of Candomblé, and she's printed on, one CDD, one City of God currency. And like they voted. So this served as a pedagogical process for the community, but it went the other way around as they had planned. So Singer here, who was the first Ministry of Solidarity Economy, in one of his interviews, he says, indigenous peoples and people from the periphery are discovering solidarity economy. And this woman is like, excuse me, like, this is what we've been doing for 500 years. And when it became more and more kind of policy centered and controlled by the white progressive, experts who are training the people in solidarity economy, she pulled out. She's like, I ain't got no time for that. And this happened across, in many of the spaces of solidarity economy. So yeah, I think one other thing I would say is when we are talking about Nana, that was displaced from Vila Autódromo, some of the families who stayed, which are like not many, like 40 families were able to stay out of hundreds of families. One thing that they have started is Termo Territorial Coletivo, which is basically a form of community land trust. So they would feel like some of their neighbors gave up and they were taking some money, like small monies, or accepting to be removed to housing projects or getting bribes, right? That their people were being co-opted. Well, the people that stayed have been connecting with favela organizers or barrio organizers in Puerto Rico, who are also experimenting with community land trust. And not many of them know exactly the history of Black communities in the United States, including urban communities, with the experience of community land trust. So speaking to the question of how do we connect, this isn't a great process that people can reclaim collective rights. And I would say in terms of freedom dream, urban quilombos and collective titling of the land as a freedom dream, and as a global Black reconstruction process that can go, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and other places where communal land can and should be claimed.
Fantastic. That's a great place, I think, to end, to leave us a great thought for us to leave on. I want to thank you both again for really wonderful presentations. You've given us a lot to think about in relation to how we think about the themes in Black Reconstruction more globally in a place like Brazil. And we really look forward to reading more of your written work, both of your book projects, which we're really excited about. We want to thank you for your generosity, spending time with us, for your comradeship. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for attending, for joining the conversation today, for asking these really important questions. Please continue to join us. Next week, as I said, we'll be talking about Black Reconstruction Geographies in Africa with Wangui Kimari and Stefan Ouma. So thanks very much, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you, Adam Bledsoe and Priscilla Ferreira.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, for the great questions. Thank you for all of y'all who made this be possible.